This passage from Mark's Gospel is probably one quite familiar to most of us here this evening. One that's so well known, it's given a title that doesn't appear in the scripture itself, but it's commonly known as the widow's mite. The background to this account is that being a widow in the early first century, as in many centuries thereafter, until social safety nets were invented, meant that a woman who lost her husband also lost the income and support he could provide her. And more often than not, that meant not only being bereaved emotionally, but also, sadly, financially impoverished as well. This was most certainly the case in the days of Jesus. And so we see throughout the Testaments, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, commandments to make sure that we take care of the have-nots, especially widows and orphans. So it is no wonder that Jesus describes the widow who placed those 2 small coins in the treasury as poor, and noted that this pittance of a contribution in the eyes of many was actually not only a huge percentage of her resources, but actually the entirety of them. So a simple lesson that might be gleaned from this passage is that generosity is never to be judged simply by the face value of the donation, but rather by the actual cost to the donor. Thus, as the widow's coins were really all that she had to live on, that seemingly small donation was actually the largest given on that particular day. But is Jesus pointing this out just to encourage our generosity? Is Jesus setting up the example of the widow for what he expects us all to do? To give to charity and church from even more than our surplus wealth, so as to risk maybe even impoverishing ourselves? Maybe some might want to propose that as Jesus' purpose, so it might be interesting to hear how other denominations might interpret this passage. Yet we probably can't completely understand the message of Jesus in this passage without considering to what and to whom the widow was actually willing to give all she had. This is, of course, in the passage, the temple treasury. And thus we have to understand the place of the temple in the lives of the Jewish people in the days of Jesus. Otherwise, we might conclude that every house of worship in our contemporary experience is somehow similar, and that would not be true at all. Indeed, the Jews of the first century regarded the temple in Jerusalem and nowhere else on earth as the very house of God, the only true dwelling place of God on earth. Thus, they revered the temple, and it was obligatory for them to support it, as is evidenced by mention of temple taxes being levied on all the faithful Jews of every place in those days. The reverence that the Jewish people had and do still have among the more orthodox of them, even in our day, is certainly well demonstrated in the deep reverence shown for the Western Wall in Jerusalem, where an original supporting wall built by Herod the Great, as he expanded the platform on which to put the temple, is seen as the largest visible remnant connected to that holy temple itself, which sadly was completely destroyed by the Romans in 72 AD. And so that wall is considered sacred. In contrast, while some may call this building and every other place dedicated to Christian worship the house of God, as a matter of fact, more accurately, it is called the house of the church. That is, of the community of believers who assemble here. But instead of saying house of the church, we have just come to shorten it as church down the ages. So that really does not have the same significance as the temple in Jerusalem being the singular house of God on earth. In fact, even though some Jewish houses of worship might commonly be called temples today, it's well understood that these are not on par with that original temple in Jerusalem. It can never be equaled in its holiness. Indeed, these temples are actually synagogues, which denotes meeting place for the Jewish people, much as church does for us. So all of that is to say that Jesus is making an example of the poor widow because of her generosity, not to a mere building, but to God himself, who was understood to be present and living there. Why, we might ask ourselves, would this woman, whose circumstances are so unfortunate, such that they've left her destitute, even be grateful to God that she would give him anything, never mind her last 2 pennies? Wouldn't she be rightfully resentful at her situation instead? Certainly some might be, but Jesus is letting us know that this widow was not, because she was obviously blessed with the insight that she was utterly dependent upon God for her very existence and her survival, and so realized that she was surviving only because of the alms that she received from people, because they were devoted to God and obedient to his commandments, such that they would care for someone like herself. So with trust that they would continue to do so, with deep gratitude to God, she risked rendering to him what was for her a most generous thanksgiving offering by supporting his dwelling place on earth. So Jesus is telling us, especially those of us who don't really have to worry where our next meal might come from, nor that we will have a roof over our heads, never to fool ourselves in our good fortune into somehow thinking we are self-sufficient. For the bottom line truth is that we would not even have life, nor any of the blessings we might enjoy in it, if it were not for God. Jesus does not want us to delude ourselves into thinking somehow that our surplus wealth might be exclusively and entirely for our enjoyment, but rather see it that it is to be used to bless others as God has blessed us. Indeed, we who have enough or more than enough to live on do not have a life of complete ease, though, as we might sometimes imagine. But rather, if we're realistic, we will know that we often face weighty and challenging choices in the situations that present themselves to us. Are we to be greedy, or are we to be generous? Are we to try to keep everything God has allowed us to accumulate for ourselves, or are we to share that generously, especially when it comes to God and those whom the 25th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel would ask us to recognize as Christ himself among us in disguise, in the poor and the needy, asking for our love and our practical support. To our eternal credit, may we be wise and loving enough here and now to make the right choice whenever that decision is presented to us, such that there will be those, just like this widow in the gospel, who are frequently rendering sacrifices of praise and thanksgiving to God because he works in and through us, moving us to the generosity that enables them to survive in this world. And who knows, we may one day need their testimony on our behalf of our charity toward them to be admitted to life in the world to come.